Alright, y'all, I got a little bit of a treat for you here, but I'm going to be honest, this is a really long video. And what started as like a simple, question or two with ChatGPT ended up being like an almost 45-minute video. And I guess this is what happens when you're bored out of your mind in Buenos Aires. So you can see that I'm back now in Texas, but the whole video was recorded in Buenos Aires. So I basically went down this rabbit hole. I started thinking like, okay, what if we compare like COVID to like, I don't know, like the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, like in terms of like how much we were spending, right? And I learned some really shocking things that you can kind of stick around and look for in the video. And I tried to use ChatGPT because don't forget, ChatGPT is really not the best when it comes to like political stuff, but I tried to navigate ChatGPT in a way that was able to kind of highlight certain things, and it totally glosses over certain things that to you and me are like astronomically important, and then some things it actually did okay on. So again, I'm basing this all off what ChatGPT gave me on. I was just bored in my room, it was raining, I couldn't do anything, I just figured that would be a great day to record one. It just ended up being a lot longer than I thought. Trust me, it's full of lots of detail and other things that you might not have known. There were certainly some things I don't remember or didn't know specifically, even though we all kind of remember just COVID was just like a giant shitstorm. And for your sake, I put like a table of contents in the description because this is a long video. So if there's certain parts that don't interest you, you can at least hop around and see what parts would interest you more and click around and look at those. Okay, y'all, it's no secret that human beings have short attention spans. I mean, who could blame us in the day and age of Instagram, Tinder, YouTube Shorts especially? And by the way, all of those apps tend to just like kind of throw that shit at you. I mean, it's really just become the norm at this point. The apps try to basically like railroad you. I mean, how many times have I used YouTube recently where I'm just like looking for a specific topic? Not only does it not give you great results based on the topic you search, but it also tries to throw all these YouTube Shorts at you. And it's like, dude, I'm not interested, right? I mean, think about how many people go like, oh man, remember Vine? I love Vine, right? And I look back at Vine, like, first of all, I never had the app, but all the fucking shit that was posted on Twitter from like the old Vines, almost all of it's fucking retarded and just stupid. I mean, it was just like really low IQ, short-circuited dog shit humor. Now, of course, once in a while, yes, there was a funny one. It's not like nothing was funny on it. I'm not interested in this 6-second devoid of substance kind of attention economy we have, but because it gets so many clicks, we have to put it on people and it's really interesting. But something that's occurred to me is that nobody's really talking about COVID anymore and hasn't been for like the last year or two, which is fine, it's in the past, but nobody's like bringing it up like, yeah, that was like some serious cognitive dissonance. It's almost kind of like disappeared into the background and become background noise, and it's just like something that happened and we're just gonna like pretend that that was normal. So someone who lived through it and saw all sorts of like wacky shit, we're just not gonna talk about it, and we're not gonna fucking shame people who like bought into that shit. I mean, we were locked down for so long, and especially if you were in a blue state. I mean, if you were in a red state, it opened way faster, but if you were in a blue state, you've got basically like double the length of like the lockdowns, or at least like strict retarded rules going on. But do people even remember what the fuck happened? I kind of walk around society sometimes and just think like we're just gonna ignore what happened. Now, of course, I'm not actually going to be back in the US for another few days, but it seems like the discourse online has just all but disappeared. And for those of us who have medium or long-term memory spans and have not fried our neurons in our brains from continually watching what the algorithm just gives us, I thought we could do a fun exercise and look at ChatGPT, of all things, talk about COVID. Now, of course, we're going to use ChatGPT, which means you need to take everything with a grain of salt. It loves to omit things, especially when it comes to political discourse. It's still just like a primitive AI. Like, I was stunned that Grok couldn't do logic puzzles, but ChatGPT could. But when it comes to this, it like routinely has been like obviously like coded into like giving out specific talking points and avoiding certain things. So with that said, we're going to take a look at it, but we're going to take things with a grain of salt. You have to ask it very specific questions to kind of be able to railroad it into trying to get it to say what you kind of want it to say, or maybe touch on things that are important that it just like originally omits and just steps over like it was no big deal. And here's where this will become a very dangerous thing, is when you have all these kids who are learning about, we'll just say, the world, they're up and coming, they don't know a whole lot, maybe they're like 10 and below, and they'll be like, Dad, what happened during COVID, right? Dad will give maybe like an NPC response, or he'll give like his response of what happened during it and his opinion. But then the kid will like ask ChatGPT what happened, right? And they're only going to get like so much information. They're not really going to be able to think of like the follow-up questions that they should really be asking that are the more important ones. Because like, let's look at it from our point of view, right? If you ask like what happened during the civil rights, right? In the 1960s, which is 60 years ago at this point, you're looking at it backwards through time. Time's just going through a few pages, right? In 1954, this happened. In 1962, this happened. And this was an event. And it's like, okay, there's day-to-day living going by. And it's just touching on it as if we could just flip a page and boom, there goes 12 years, you know? So in a similar fashion, those of us who kind of look back and go like, what the fuck was that, right? It's not going to be reflected in those books, right? Because even though like historical recounts of it might have like differing opinions and be like, what the fuck was that? Or just like, oh, you know, it happened. I mean, I'm just using it as an example, obviously. But trying to transmit like the 10 or 15 years where this shit fucking happened, it was very, very conflicting at the time and changed society. And trying to put that all into like a page or like being able to read so that the reader understands exactly what was happening and the bigger implications of this on society, you're almost never going to get that. And that's why videos are like so important, because it's kind of like being able to pass on like oral tradition almost, you know? assuming that things just don't get banned, right? But you can give your recount of like what happened during COVID, what you saw in your eyes, and it'll live infamously as long as it doesn't get banned or taken down, or the internet continues being the internet for who knows how long, rather than just like having an artificial intelligence write about it and kind of say what it was important to it, and not really expanding on what the important touch points are based on that. So here's some good comedy material. I asked it what happened during COVID, and it gave us a clear summary. So the outbreak and the lockdowns in early 2020, the first U.S. COVID case appeared in January 2020 in Washington. In March, the U.S. declared a national emergency. States went into lockdown. Schools, restaurants, and non-essential businesses closed. It talks nothing about the panic that went on, about people buying up tons of, toilet paper, panic buying all sorts of shit. There were lines outside of supermarkets because people were running out of stuff. Things had to get rationed. You could only get, one roll of toilet paper, a day, I think. States went into lockdown. Schools, restaurants, and non-essential businesses closed, whatever was deemed as a non-essential and essential business. People were told to stay home, wear masks, and socially distance, as I was doing at the beginning of it. Because, to be honest with you, this was kind of like the bubonic plague. We had no fucking clue. We only had so much information from the news going on. I mean, this thing was spreading really quickly in China. I mean, it could have been lethal, and we tried to treat it as such, and some of us were buying stuff in February like, dude, what the fuck is going on? So the point was, this thing was terrifying. Who would have knew? There could have been, dead bodies in the streets. We didn't know what the fuck to expect. Air travel dropped 90%, and cities like New York City became epicenters. Economic shock and government response. Unemployment skyrocketed to over 20 million jobs lost in April of 2020. I lost mine at the end of March. The government passed massive stimulus bills. The CARES Act around March 2020, $1,200 checks, expanded unemployment. Business loans later rounds added more checks and rental assistance. This kind of makes it sound like, oh, this is no problem. This is just what the government does. It gives you some checks. You lose your job, here, have some money. The federal rate slashed interest rates to near zero. The stock market crashed in March 2020, but recovered fast. The fastest rebound in history due to government spending and easy money. Fastest rebound in history. Man, the Americans were doing really well during COVID. Oh man, there's nothing to worry about. It was a fast rebound. What a great time to be alive. Okay, vaccines and polarization. Vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, and J&J rolled out in late 2020 and early 2021. Some states reopened quickly like Florida and Texas, while others stayed cautious. California and New York. Not doing mental gymnastics with these rules that didn't even prevent shit, but they just remained cautious. Notice ChatGPT's rhetoric here.
Okay, had a little problem with the editing. The pandemic became politically divisive. Mask mandates and vaccines split along party lines. Vaccine passports and the workplace mandates were introduced in some areas, fueling protests. Okay, vaccine passports were suggested by all these kind of morons, and it's totally ironic, right? Their whole thing is like, oh yeah, you shouldn't be able to show your ID when you're voting, right? But you need a vaccine passport to get around. It's just like the mental gymnastics never stop with these folks, and they basically just if the media points in a general direction, the army of masses of NPCs will look at that and be like, huh? What's that? We should totally abide by it and it's a great idea. And it's just mind-numbingly dumb, but it's just human nature and we're stuck with it. Cultural and social impact. Millions worked remotely, changing work culture permanently. This is kind of crazy because before it was pretty taboo to be working from home, working remotely, but because so many people got shoved away from their jobs. I was kicked out of my job for a little while, right? I had to work remotely for 2 weeks, I think, before I got let go of. And it was only by force, not by choice. A lot of people didn't choose this. And when you work from home, it's the same thing as going to school via Zoom. It's there's so many more distractions, right? You have family, especially if you're someone who's been in the workforce for a while, you're going to have kids. You're going to have kids coming up to you because you're home, and it's just they don't really see it as working. It's oh, mom and dad are home, right? There's an infinite amount of distractions. I was living at home at the time. My parents would come in, and it's dude, I'm fucking working right now. I got to get this shit done. And they wouldn't take it seriously. It's kind of hilarious how the role kind of flipped for that, But overall, it became way more common. So when I went to Argentina, I found a lot more people working remotely for the United States companies. Of course, when you're making 3/4 of whatever you would make in the States, and you go to that country, who cares if you're getting a pay cut? You're living like a king in Argentina or other third world countries. And so that's why we've seen a lot of people traveling as well. People hated COVID. And it was a great excuse to go explore the world. And it's very easy now. There's a lot more online and remote work available. Migration patterns shifted. People left big cities for suburbs and cheaper states. I don't know about people leaving big cities, but the cheaper states things 100%. A lot of New Yorkers went to Florida. A lot of Californians went to Texas. A lot of Californians went to Nevada as well. Nevada used to be pretty cheap. Now I think it's kind of got that California spillover effect. And Nevada, while it's still a lot cheaper than California, is certainly feeling it compared to, say, 10 years ago.
Education moved online. Kids lost in-person learning for months to over a year in some areas. Conspiracy theories and mistrust in government and media skyrocketed. Yeah, gee, I wonder why. Skyrocketed is really an understatement. Mental health issues and drug overdoses rose sharply. Wow, you mean to tell me limiting social interactions bad mentally? And people are going to turn to drugs and external other things when they don't have friends and shit? Who would have guessed? Let's talk really more about education moving online though. So when you have a bunch of kids
and they're being isolated and they can't like meet other kids and they're sitting indoors all day. I mean, kids are like very like exploratory creatures. You have to be outside with them all the time, otherwise they'll just go stir crazy indoors. They'll drive you crazy as a parent, probably. I don't speak from experience, but I can tell you this: I've always been an outdoorsy person. When I was growing up, we were outdoors quite a lot. Of course, the internet wasn't that big back then, but we were constantly playing with other kids outside. So to take that away from someone and, you know, make them kind of turn towards the easier solution, which is going to be like turning towards tablets, iPads, right? Like for a kid, that's more devastating because you're like frying their circuitry. They're getting instant dopamine hits. And when your brain's not developed, it's very dangerous when you kind of rewire that circuitry in place of what could have been. The other bullshit factor, and this is really one that was like egregious, was when you had kids. I wasn't in college because I had graduated shortly before that. But when you have a bunch of kids in college, the tuition was a huge sort of factor. So for example, when you have COVID and all these facilities are getting shut down, they're not being used as like the bastions of like giving lectures because everyone's moving to online in the case of that emergency. Well, you would think that the tuition could be reduced by some X amount, right? It shouldn't be a full 100% amount, right? But this is where it's bullshit. The university said, yeah, here you go. You can have the full 100% tuition. Kiss my ass, and you're going to pay full price. Do you know what kind of bullshit that is when you're not even... So what are you paying? It's already over-glorified, like, daycare at this point. But to be charged full price for something that you know is pretty bullshit a lot of the time, I'm glad I got a real degree because it is just like a huge fuck you to anyone who went to college. I mean, these are 5-figure sums you're having to fork over. If mommy and daddy had to pay for it, or you're putting yourself in debt for this at full price when you barely even get a product. And most of these, the standard of classes was like one level at like before COVID. And yes, it's not very good right now, but like during COVID, I know shit was fucking bullshit. A lot of these teachers in college love to just use like the book and the book sanctioned questions. So they'll just like turn to like McGraw-Hill or use the online shit. And those are a pain in the ass, and a lot of the time they don't even have to do what the lecture necessarily directly was talking about, and that's why it was so fucking infuriating. So everyone has started using Chegg and all sorts of other stuff when I was in it. Because look, if you're too lazy to give us homework that actually has to do with the lesson plan in the exact format that you gave us, why the hell am I going to do this homework thing, which is beyond anal and binary? And if you don't get the exact answer, it tells you you're wrong, go fuck yourself, you get like 5 tries. It was really annoying back in the day. Aftermath. COVID faded as an emergency by 2022, but inflation surged from stimulus and supply chain shocks. Whoa. Who would have guessed there's long-term consequences to just giving people free money? Many Americans became distrustful of institutions, CDC, government, and pharma. Well, yeah, they were lying a lot. The pandemic reshaped politics, work, and social attitudes, less faith in experts, more polarization, and push for independence and remote lifestyles. So I told it to tell me more about the CARES Act, because it loves to just omit details. Yes, it's an AI, but it's going to miss a lot of things, especially when it comes to politics like this. And so it says, perfect, you're asking the right questions. Most people only remember the $1,200 checks, but the CARES Act and easy money policies that followed were enormous structural shifts in how the U.S. government and Federal Reserve handled crises. Let's go deeper. The CARES Act, March of 2020, the biggest stimulus in modern U.S. history. Signed on March 27th, 2020, and I lost my job maybe the 26th or a few days before that. I think it was the 26th. Total size was about $2.2 trillion, roughly 10% of the U.S. GDP at the time. To put that in perspective, it was larger than the entire U.S. federal budget of 2000. Key components: direct payments, stimulus checks, $1,200 per adult, $500 per child. It phased out at about $75,000 for individuals, and it was sent over to 150 million Americans. It expanded unemployment benefits. Federal government added $600 a week on top of state benefits. Millions received more from unemployment than their jobs, and it lasted roughly 4 months, March to July of 2020, before tapering down. Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, about $800 billion in forgivable loans to small businesses. If used mostly on payroll, the loan turned into a grant. Massive fraud followed. Estimates suggest $200 billion may have been stolen. Corporate bailouts, $500 billion for major industries like airlines, who of course ate it during all that. Treasury and Fed created special facilities to backstop corporate bonds. $500 billion fund for major industries like airlines. State and local aid, hospitals, education. Tens of billions went to state governments, public health systems, and schools. Easy money from the Federal Reserve. While Congress printed fiscal money, the Fed handled the monetary side. What they did was cut interest rates to 0% within days. They launched quantitative easing, buying trillions of dollars of treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. Quantitative easing being that dumb shit socialist love, which is from, I think, Maynard Keynes. And it created a special lending program to ensure corporate debt, junk bonds, and even ETFs could find buyers. The Fed's balance sheet doubled from $4 trillion to $8 trillion in less than a year. This was effectively money creation. The Fed digitally printed dollars by purchasing financial assets. This is no different than anything they had done before. This has been a problem since the gold standard went away. It stems back even further from when we had a central bank. 3. Short-term effects. The economy didn't collapse. Unemployment dropped from 15% April of 2020 to under 7% by the year's end. The stock markets boomed, so to say. The S&P 500 hit record highs by August of 2020. Home prices exploded. Cheap credit plus stay-at-home orders equals a housing frenzy. Consumers saved money and spent aggressively once the lockdowns ended, and boy didn't they. In short, the U.S. avoided a depression by flooding the system with cash. Okay, so here's the thing. We've had policymakers making terrible decisions for years and years and years, and we're getting to a point where we're trying to avoid whatever the crash is and the repercussions of our actions. People are trying to avoid reaping what they sow. I remember I was watching a video about Plato once, and he said, how on earth could a doctor ever try to outwit a candy shop owner if they were both running for office? You have like a candy shop owner who's just basically just like corrupt politicians and such, and he's like, oh man, I'm gonna feed you guys sweet, it's delicious, it tastes great. And the doctor, dude, he wants to hurt you to make you feel better, right? And a lot of the time when you're trying to do things that are productive for your body in the long term, such as, lifting weights, doing the hard things, avoiding eating like shit, yeah, in the short term it doesn't show any effects, and even it's a little bit pleasurable, right? Just like candy. However, in the long term, you're gonna feel like shit more, your body's gonna be obese, your body's gonna hate you, you filled it with garbage, and so it's a long-term disaster, but short-term, people don't look at that. So the candy shop owner is the guy that's going to get the vote more often because more people are just like, oh my god, let's just go with the guy that gives us the stuff that makes us feel a lot better. It's almost just like being a drug dealer. You could have a bunch of drug dealers, and it's probably not too far from what's happening. You could have drug dealers just run for office and they would get in. All right, free drugs for everyone. Let's all feel good, right? This isn't going to do any harm to our body, right? And the doctor's supposed to be able to say something like, oh yeah, I'm trying to help you by hurting you. For example, if you have to do surgery, that's going to be a pain in the ass and hurt. But in the long term, it's supposedly going to be good for you. So when people try to make the easy decision over and over again in the short term, yeah, it's not that bad. But when you do it for long periods of time, it stacks up and it implodes. So when we have all these fucking terrible policies, such as bailing out banks in 2008, we go to war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and those rack up huge amounts of debt. Well, at some point, we're going to have a crash, and especially after we take ourselves off the gold standard, you have to reap what you sow. You make bad decisions, you're going to get bad effects. The worse and worse your decisions are, the more and more catastrophic the ensuing problem is going to be. So yes, we may have avoided a catastrophe or a depression with COVID, but at the same time, if you flood shitloads and shitloads of cash into the system to kind of, plug holes in the boat while it's sinking, well, you just make the sinking that much worse. Like if you think of a boat and it's got like a huge gash, well, yeah, you might be able to duct tape it through, right? But it's only going to be able to hold for so long, and people think you're safe again because the boat's not totally sinking, and it takes a while for the boat to sink. But trust me, once the duct tape breaks, it's just going to absolutely come through, and people are going to be like, well, I thought we fixed the problem. And they'll just be blindsided, and it'll be even worse. And I guess the boat is the group of decisions that people had made, and they'd made so many weak decisions with weak infrastructure that it makes the boat much easier to sink. I don't know, not the best analogy, but that's what I have in the heat of the moment. Okay, long-term consequences. Inflation explosion. Too much money, too few goods. Inflation rose from under 2% in 2020 to 9.1% by mid-2022, the highest interest since the 1980s. Everyday costs of rent, cars, and groceries surged, eroding real wages. And of course, it wouldn't be awful if wages were rising at the exact same amount, but wages stayed like right here, and fucking inflation went way the fuck up. So obviously wages couldn't keep up, and because the government printed a shitload of money, everything got worse, price-wise at least. Fed had to reverse course, hiking rates aggressively from 0 to over 5% by 2023. Stocks, crypto, and housing all inflated beyond fundamentals. Okay, well this is where ChatGPT is getting it a little bit wrong. So when you look at stocks, yes, they inflated, and crypto, yes, they inflated. But crypto and housing specifically, it's interesting, right? Because you look at supply and demand, you have only so much crypto, and this is what's great about like Bitcoin specifically, is you're only ever going to have so much Bitcoins ever, right? And once they're mined, like that's it. You can't inflate them by creating more and more Bitcoins the way that you can with some other cryptos. They're useful just like gold because there's only so much of them, and they can't be inflated, and therefore it's like a currency that a government or whoever else can't prod and just create out of thin air. And thus we would get to a problem like this. You'll never have like wage inflation, for example. If we switch to crypto today, wage inflation wouldn't be a thing because there's only so much crypto. Houses too. There's only so many houses. You can only build so many houses at a time, but really there's only like a limited number of houses. You can't just create houses out of nothing, right? You can't just wave your magic wand and boom, it's a house. The way that you can print like money. Now you can create a house, you can mine for gold, but those are physical things that have to happen. You can't just like, stamp it on the books and call it a day. Which is why I always tell people, if you're trying to hang on to the system as it is, you're in for a rude awakening when the time does come. When rates rose, these bubbles popped, wiping out trillions in paper wealth. The government debt spiral. U.S. national debt jumped from 23 trillion to 31 trillion by 2023. That is insane. Interest payments alone are now one of the largest federal expenses. The U.S. entered a zone where the debt grows faster than GDP, making long-term financial stability questionable. Questionable is like one of the most nice, friendly terms you could possibly ever make it. It's going to implode at some point, and you can't do anything to stop it at this point. We have a central bank. We do not have a gold standard. The government can print money when shit hits the fan, and it really needs to do it. It will print money. It'll keep adding more debt. It will always run at a deficit. We're at a point with all the inflation where if politicians can spend as much money as they possibly can, they will do so. It's like almost like the Ouroboros where the snake is eating its own tail. It's just a system that has been created now where it will keep going around and around, and there's no stopping it. Like, for example, the New York guy, Mandani, just got elected. People are promising the moon on a stick. This is really all kind of a problem, especially since after COVID, with all the free checks from the government. It's just like people got checks from the government. Oh, dude, why don't we just do this before? Let's just start making money from the government. And here's the thing. You know what a pain in the ass is to get money out of the government, especially if you have a job. If the government is handing you money free willy-nilly, here's $1,200, you have to know that something is seriously fucking wrong. You're like the last person on the totem pole that it cares about. Cultural shift towards dependency and distrust. Many Americans realized the government could print and send money directly, breaking the old fiscal discipline mindset. Yeah, that's been shattered at this point. It was already going downhill, but now there's like no semblance of it. So, when things are going down, how can we turn this around? Are things ever going to turn around and get better and better? Are we really going to elect politicians with the masses that are unintelligent, that are going to say, oh yeah, we need to do the hard thing now so that things don't get worse in the long term? It's not a winning proposition. It's exactly what I said about the sweet shop owner and the doctor. The doctor's going to be like, look, you got to eat your broccoli, you got to eat your cauliflowers, eat some spinach, eat some fruits, stop eating so much sugar. Sugar gives you cancer. But the people who are just like very like level one thinkers looking what's immediately around them are going to be like, nope, I'm eating sugar. I don't care about all that shit. The sugar tastes good. This is what I like. Long term, they're going to have cancer, and they're going to be like, oh man, I didn't know I fucking had this problem. How did this happen? It was a slow, small death by 1,000 cuts. You chose the easy way out. The hard path is trying to stay disciplined, avoid as much sugar as you can, as in not like excessively eat it, and then eat fruits and vegetables, get some goddamn exercise, especially in today's world. It's hard to do that. But it's not fun to look at the hard decisions, but you have to make them, or else you're going to be stuck with the easy decision results in the long term. That's uglier. Work incentives warp. Some people refuse to return to low-wage jobs because unemployment paid more. That is one of the most hilarious, stupid fucking ways we're going to have to tell people that the American system really just like ate shit. Like if we look back in time, like 100 years from now, people are going to be like, oh yeah, how did they fall apart? Well, people stopped going to work because the welfare was better than getting a job. When you're on welfare or you're getting money from the government, you can just sit at home and not do anything. And you can get like 3/4 of your pay, or you can get the extra 25% of the pay, or sometimes even worse pay, by going to a job, dealing with other people, having to navigate all these personalities, the office politics, the even minimum wage kind of cashier politics, I guess you could say. Whatever the workplace politics are going to be, you have to navigate that situation, and you have to deal with customers or clients, and you have to deal with other people, and you have to work most of the time. Or you can just take a 25% pay cut and just sit at home and do fucking nothing. You get to do whatever you want. You get to gorge on YouTube videos, the algorithm. Your life just becomes like a pleasure simulator. It's like the ultimate hedonism formula. Combined with inflation and housing crises, this fueled a loss of trust in institutions and accelerated polarization. Fed credibility and future risks. The Fed overcorrected, first keeping rates too low, then hiking too fast. The easy money era ended violently. 2022 to 2023 saw bank failures. I remember the Silicon Valley Bank Signature Bank things because rapid rate hikes crushed portfolios built on cheap money. It exposed how fragile the financial system became after years of artificial support. And do you think that went away and that artificial support has been weeded out and we're not living in a system of total artificial support? Look, man, the boat is sinking. The plane is losing altitude. Well, yeah, no shit. You keep putting ice cream in everyone's mouth and thinking that they're going to have long-term mobility. It's just not going to happen. It's so much harder to be aware of this. You can take the blue pill and just kind of sit in your bed and watch Instagram for 15 hours a day and wonder why you don't have a girlfriend and you make no money, or you can do the hard things, try to break free of the system, and at least be aware of things. Big picture philosophically, the CARES Act and quantitative easing created a temporary illusion of prosperity built on borrowed time. It rewired expectations. People now expect rescues in every crisis. Corporations expect the Fed to step in if markets fall. Moral hazard. Oh no, our airplanes. We were putting 55,000 airplanes out when we really only had space for 45,000 if everything shut down. And because everything was flying, now the people have to basically pay the people for making bad decisions in the airlines. It's just mind-blowingly disgusting. The middle class got squeezed. Wages couldn't keep up with acid inflation. There's another way to go fuck yourself. Money printer go burr meme, classic. It defined the era of cynicism towards economics and governance. Money printer does go burr, and money printer cannot stop going burr because we've done this to ourselves, and we're going to reap the rewards. Tell me more about letter C when it went from 23 trillion to 31 trillion in just a few short years. Excellent. This is the real meat of the long-term problem. Let's go deep into point C, the U.S. government debt spiral, focusing on how the national debt exploded from 23 trillion to over 31 trillion in just 3 years, and why that's not just more debt, but a fundamental shift in how America finances itself. The baseline, 23 trillion pre-COVID in early 2020. Before COVID, the U.S. already carried out $23 trillion in federal debt, which is a shitload. That wasn't exactly small, but it had been climbing for years due to Bush-era wars, terrible, 2008 financial crisis bailouts, another fucking criminal supreme error by the government, Trump's 2017 tax cuts, which reduced revenue without cutting spending. Oh no, what are we going to do? More people are holding on to their money instead of giving it to the government so that they can go to freaking Bush wars and 2008 financial crisis bailouts. Trump's 2017 tax cuts, which reduced revenue without cutting spending. Oh no, we're going to have to make do with spending less. How are we ever going to do this? How will we ever fund the 2008 financial crisis bailout without taxing people more? And then the Bush-era wars of Iraq and Afghanistan. How can we ever fund our wars without more taxes? Lower taxes, we're going to have to cut a shitload of this. But generally, I don't see this changing course. The explosion, 2020 to 2023. Then came COVID. Congress went on a wartime-level spending spree. In 2020, the CARES Act, federal facilities, and other relief cost $2.2 trillion to $2.5 trillion. In 2021, additional stimulus cost $1.9 trillion. We're already getting to the $4.5 trillion mark. The Infrastructure Chips Act and Inflation Reduction Act, all under Biden, was $1.5 trillion combined. Inflation Reduction Act. So that was $8 trillion. By mid-2023, the total public debt exceeded $31 trillion. That's a 35% jump in just 3 years. To compare, it took the U.S. almost its entire history before 2008 to accumulate the first $10 trillion. Now, don't forget, this is not inflationarily apples to apples, but it is skyrocketing in comparison. What's actually in that debt? $25 trillion held by the public, investors, bank, Fed, and foreign governments. $6 trillion intergovernmental holdings, Social Security, and federal pension funds. The biggest foreign holders are Japan, $1.1 trillion, China, $860 billion, and the UK and EU are about $700 billion plus. So America is essentially borrowing from its own citizens, bank, and the world to sustain its spending. And I'm sure that people won't get sick of us trying to spend a shitload of their money. Hey China, can I have another couple $100 billion so that I can, spend more money on my citizens? What made this jump so dangerous? The interest burden blew up. When debt rose and interest rates went up after 2022, the U.S. faced a double punch. In 2020, the U.S. paid roughly $345 billion in interest. By 2023, it nearly doubled to $700 billion. In 2025, it's projected to exceed $1 trillion annually, more than defense spending. So we went from $345 billion to almost $1 trillion annually. That's almost 3 times up the rate in 5 years. And you mean to tell me we're supposed to be avoiding a market crash? You need to have the chips fall where they may, sir. This is not natural, going up 300%. I mean, in the next 10 years, what do you think is going to happen? If we even have like a medium level society kind of problem, things are just going to be so much infinitely worse. Interest payments are mandatory, meaning that every new dollar of debt must pay for old promises such as Social Security, Medicare, military and domestic programs, now huge interest bills on past debt. That limits future flexibility. It's like paying only credit card interest and never touching the principal. Well, this is an excellent formula, as you can see. Structural deficits. Even after COVID ended, the U.S. kept spending more than it collected every year. Every deficit stayed around 1.5 to 2 trillion, even in peacetime. That means even if nothing bad happens, no wars, no pandemics, debt keeps rising because the baseline budget is unsustainable. Even in peacetime, pretend we do. We had some external stupid fucking war that we end up going to. That means we shift from 1.5 trillion to 2 trillion to some larger, more scary number. And we're supposed to financially be a first world country? The Federal Reserve stopped buying as many treasuries once quantitative easing ended. China and Japan have reduced their holdings to defend their own currencies, and I don't blame them. That leaves U.S. banks, money markets, and pension funds as main buyers, but they demand higher interest to compensate. Yeah, no shit. That's why Treasury yields have risen, not just because the Fed hikes, but because investors want to be paid more to fund Washington's deficits. Long-term consequences. Debt servicing becomes a budget trap. If rates stay around 4 to 5% and debt keeps growing, by 2030 the U.S. could spend 1.5 to 2 trillion a year just on interest, which is a mind-blowing number. That's more than all discretionary domestic spending combined. At that point, even a modest recession would explode the deficit further because tax revenue would drop, but expenses would rise, unemployment benefits, bailouts, etc. And that's literally what I just said 2 seconds ago, crowding out. When the government borrows trillions every year, it soaks up private capital that could have gone to businesses, mortgages, and startups. That keeps long-term interest rates high and slows private sector growth. Currency and inflation risks. Investors start questioning whether the U.S. can ever balance its books. Questioning. If confidence erodes, the dollar's dominance as the global reserve currency could weaken. No shit. The Fed might face pressure to monetize debt again, print money to buy treasury bonds, which would reignite inflation. Political and government fallout. Younger Americans increasingly see the system as rigged. Huge national debt, expensive housing, poor wage growth, and trillions wasted. Yep. This fuels populist politics on both sides, left-wing socialism and right-wing nationalism. Politicians keep promising more programs or tax cuts, ignoring the structural math because cutting spending is political suicide. And that is the real problem. Can you imagine the sweet shop owner saying like, oh, I need 1,000 calories of sugar every day. Well, now you need to be eating 1,500. Now you need to be eating 2,000. Well, imagine he's saying like, okay, you need to be having 3,300 calories in just sugar a day. And then a politician coming in like, look, I know that we can't ever balance the books to say 0 grams of sugar a day or less than 100 grams of sugar a day, but we should go from 3,300 to 2,300 so that we can make our way down. That is like politically just like you might as well just do this at that point, you know? So philosophically, what changed? Before COVID, there was at least a rhetorical limit on how much debt was acceptable. After 2020, that taboo vanished. Congress learned it could print and borrow limitless money with minimal short-term pain. The problem? That works only until interest payments eat the system alive. And that's just, like I said, the Ouroboros eating itself. It's a quiet trap. The growing share of the U.S. tax dollars now just service old promises, not building anything new. It's like a civilization that's mortgaging its future to maintain its past. Would you like me to go on a deeper level and explain how this debt explosion actually changed the Fed's control over inflation and markets? Basically, now the Fed is trapped between two bad choices, inflation or insolvency. And that's where the whole system really starts to wobble. Well, so naturally, because we kind of just skipped over a lot of the stuff, I kind of wanted to break down what each of these things were. And said, perfect, that's exactly where this $8 trillion, just break each one down. Each of these has a distinct goal, but together they change how the U.S. government intervenes in the economy. The scale, $2.2 trillion, the biggest single spending bill in U.S. history, which is the CARES Act. The purpose was to prevent the economy from collapsing during the lockdown. So the direct stimulus checks were $300 billion, $1,200 per adult and $500 per child, and expanded unemployment, extra $600 a week, extended eligibility to gig workers. This right here is $500 billion, and basically just throwing money at people. The Payment Protection Program was $659 billion of forgivable loans to keep people employed. So rather than put them on the unemployment plan, we're going to keep them propped up and duct tape the boat with even more than we just threw at people in the first place. Corporate credit plus airline bailouts, Treasury Fed loans guaranteed, $500 billion. That's not far. That's about half of what just the normal people got. Healthcare response, $180 billion. Hospitals, testing, vaccine R&D, state and local aid, budget backfill for tax losses. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's use tax money to make up for tax losses. What? And I guess to be fair, they weren't using taxes. They were just inflating it and giving them fake money. It prevented mass layoffs. That's great. Rather than let the person reap what they sowed for eating 3,300 calories of sugar a day, we're just going to find another short-term solution to prevent what should actually happen, which is a hard, stern conversation about, hey, you got to stop being a fat ass. Household incomes rose in 2020 despite the shutdown. Well, when you pay people enough, right? Stocks rebounded almost immediately because liquidity flooded the system. Federal Reserve facilities 2020 and 2021. Parallel to the CARES Act, the Fed launched a monetary shock absorption wall. Quantitative easing infinity, bought $120 billion a month of blah, blah, blah. Corporate bond facility for the first time ever, Fed backstopped corporate debt and EFTs. Municipal liquidity facility lent directly to states and cities. Main Street lending program, loans to mid-sized firms. Fed's balance sheet basically doubled in under 2 years. This was easy money, trillions conjured electrically to stabilize credit marketers. Every empire does this when they're falling because they can't actually make goods and services. They're just going to inject a bunch of inflationary money. We saw it with Rome with the denarius. And this is usually right before shit hits the fan. American Rescue Plan of March in 2021. Jumpstart recovery and continue stimulus under Biden. Now we got $1,400 checks to most Americans. Maybe I'm actually remembering this instead of the $1,200. Extended $300 weekly unemployment through September of 2021. The child tax credit expansion. Monthly checks to families, $350 billion to state and local governments, $160 for vaccine rollouts and health systems, and $170 for schools and universities. The schools and universities, which didn't actually need to be receiving all that tuition, although people stopped enrolling and shit like that. Fueled the 2021 demand boom that helped trigger inflation, pushed the deficit back for $3 trillion for the second year in a row. Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, November of 2021. The scale was $1.2 trillion, $550 in new spending, hard infrastructure, roads, bridges, blah, blah, blah. And you can see the breakdown over here. The CHIPS Act and Science Act of August 2022. The goal was to reshore semiconductor manufacturing and reduce China's dependence. $220 billion with $52 directly in subsidies and $200 billion in R&D funding authorization. The goal was to reshore semiconductor manufacturing and reduce China's dependence. Grants, tax credits, and Intel, TSMC, and Samsung U.S. plants. Incentives for STEM education and R&D labs. This is like the one thing that was like kind of not like terrible during the Biden administration is we've been so dependent on so many other places. Like for example, if we go buy shit from China for like clothes, well yeah, we're kind of endorsing their slave labor. So if we can find a way to bring all that shit back, yes, it'll be more expensive, but we won't be dependent. So if something like the pandemic does happen again, where China says, you know what, go fuck yourself, we're not going to give you that, we don't have to depend on them anymore. And yes, it might be more expensive in the U.S., but at least we have access to it. Remember, China just decided to shut its borders for certain products, and the U.S. was severely crippled, at least in like parts of the medical industry or something like that. I don't know if I really remember. But I do remember it was kind of like, okay, we should just bring all that shit back. Like sometimes paying the higher price for the quality of goods, like being able to produce it in-house is just better. The Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, $737 billion total, $369 spending, and $300 is of deficit reduction to new taxes. Prescription drug reform. Medicare can negotiate prices. The worst one of all this is the IRS expansion. $80 billion was coming for us with more audits and tech upgrades. Okay. Why the fuck would we want more IRS? The IRS is one of the most hated agencies of the US government. They're a pain in the ass to deal with. I mean, the amount of memes that you see about people calculating taxes and the burden and the onus being on the taxpayer to figure out what they have to pay rather than just getting like a bill. Granted, with enough time, they would change it so that they could just like charge whatever they want. But if they know the number or have a ballpark estimate, they give you no information and they're very slow. So if you're in their crosshairs, it might actually take a few years for you to get there. And then one of the worst things was a lot of liberals and Democrats actually said like, yes, we want more IRS agents. It's like, whoa, what? You guys want to pay more taxes? Everyone hates the IRS, and you're telling me that you guys are backing the IRS? I mean, the joke is always like, what, if you work at the IRS, you always tell people you do anything but work at the IRS? Because if you get ousted publicly that you work for the IRS, people aren't like very going to be like friends with you and such. Anyway, the combined consequences. Total added commitments was $8 trillion. The debt went from 23 to 31 trillion. Inflation peaked in 2022 to 9%. And this is the government number, by the way. Do we think it was a little higher than that? Probably. Interest burden went from $700 billion a year, and it's probably going to continue climbing. And the structural shift, Washington and the Fed function as joint insurers of everything: jobs, markets, companies, and states. That's right, we have Washington doing everything for us now, and individuality is shrinking. Long-term markets expect bailouts as normal, which is terrible. Fiscal discipline eroded, which is devastating because it was already pretty bad. Debt service will crowd out discretionary spending, and political divide deepened over who benefits: corporations or households. Kind of a fun thought experiment now. Tell me how much the deficit jumped during the Iraq and Afghan wars in comparison to the non-wartime apocalyptic spending that took place during COVID that you just described. So it says, excellent question. Honesty is one of the most revealing comparisons you can make about how normalized trillion-dollar deficits have become. Let's walk through both eras and look at how wartime spending compares to COVID-era peacetime stimulus. The reason I asked it that way is because when you look back in history, you can see that war is extremely expensive. And if you're spending a shitload of money to the point where you're in peacetime and it compares to wartime, that's really bad. I mean, if we went to war right now, how much do you think it would cost? I can tell you what, I probably can't count that high. The War on Terror era, 2001 to 2011. The Iraq War cost around $3 trillion. Afghanistan was $2 trillion. These are all government estimates, by the way. The total direct and indirect was 4 to 6 million over 2 decades. 4 to 6 trillion over 2 decades. That is a mind-blowing amount of money. Think about how much money we gave with free shit to people. We just looked at it 2 seconds ago. It was like, what, 500 billion to citizens, and then like 500 billion to airlines, and we spent 4 times that in these wars. And we didn't even achieve anything. Like, what it was achieved? Okay, yes, it was all really about oil, but like, one of the questions I saw in a YouTube video once was like someone having an interview and saying, okay, well, what does victory look like? We've restored democracy. What does that mean? This includes operations and logistics, the Pentagon budgets, VA and veteran health costs, and then also interest on the borrowed money. Federal deficit in 2001, don't forget this is not all inflationarily adjusted. 2001, $128 billion pre 9/11. 2002, $158 billion, war and tax cuts. 2003, $378 billion, Iraq invasion. 2004 to 2007, $300 to $400 billion average, ongoing wars. 2008, $458 billion, financial crisis, and we're still funding shitloads of money. 2009, $1.4 trillion, stimulus and bailouts. And when you think of most of the fighting, most of it was done like when? Really in the early part of the war, 2003, 2004, 2005, right? 2006. So during the height of 2 simultaneous wars, the annual deficit rarely exceeded $400 billion until 2008. The debt grew from 5.8 trillion to 10 trillion, 4 trillion over a decade, which was a lot. In other words, the U.S. fought 2 long wars and endured a global financial crisis and still added less total debt than what COVID spending added in a single year. Wow, ChatGPT actually kind of said it right. The COVID era, 2020 to 2023. 984 billion was in 2019, 3.31 trillion was in 2020, 2.7 trillion was in 2021, 1.38 trillion was in 2022, and in 2023, 1.7. Now, if you looked at my inflation video about 6 months ago, you know that in 1997, everything was basically half price or had 200% spending power of what it does now. So when you're putting in $458 billion in like 2008, that's probably worth like 800 billion, 700 billion today. And we're knocking it out of the park with all these fucking humongous spending bills. Scale comparison, war on terror, 400 trillion, wars, tax cuts, and crises. Then you look at COVID-19, and it added 8 trillion in like a single year or two. The average annual deficit was 5 times that at $2 trillion, and the pandemic and stimulus and giving free money to people were the main causes of that. So COVID spending created twice the debt in 1/3 of the time in 20 years of war and crisis did. Of course, not adjusted for inflation, but still, that's fucking mind-blowing. We've gone out of our minds here. Here's the main thing. 2002 to 2011, we're spending this much, and now we're spending, let me get a little closer here, 2001 to 2005, we're spending like, what, this much, and then we go to 2008, we spend a little more, and now we're spending like, what, 4 times that, so we're like exponentially spending more. I'll tell you what, I don't think we're going to be spending any less, and we're just going to keep spending until we hit rock bottom and something happens. Maybe the US dollar doesn't become the world reserve currency. Maybe the US dollar implodes or becomes like so inflationary that it's kind of useless. I can tell you while I'm down here in Argentina, this currency is like fucking ridiculous. But with us inflating the fuck out of our currency, people are going to trust us less and less and less. Maybe they'll have a gold callback and the US might not want to give it back. So it remains to be seen, but as things keep getting better and better because we had the biggest market rebound in the biggest crisis of all time, it's really just kind of deceptive because I'm actually reading a book called Anti-Fragile right now. I'll probably do a video on this later. But the longer and longer you kick the can down the road, avoiding the inevitable consequences of your decisions, the worse and worse the blowback will be. So if we avoided a Great Depression because we kind of spent our way out of it, whatever's coming, whether it be financial, is gonna when the bill comes due, it's gonna be very ugly. Or maybe I'm wrong and everything just gets all fucking better and the Democrats and Republicans shake hands and conservatives and socialists shake hands and they meet in the middle somewhere. Now, if that doesn't sound ridiculous to you, then, you can kind of see where the ship is going here. During the war, spending was discretionary and debated. Congress authorized each war budget. Deficits were viewed as temporary emergencies. The public still talks about fiscal responsibility. Can you imagine that? During the COVID era, trillions were spent via omnibus and executive programs with little scrutiny, which was ugly. Both parties backed record deficits with no offsetting cuts. Republicans really fucking suck for that. The Federal Reserve monetized most of the new debt through quantitative easing, which is also code word for not being financially responsible or fiscally. Result, the U.S. essentially discovered wartime level borrowing in peacetime, and markets didn't punish it immediately, so policymakers assumed it was safe. That's a very naive way to put it, but if you want to make it sound as nice and pleasant as possible for them, you can say that. Really what more happened was the markets didn't punish it immediately, more like everyone felt the blowback, and not everyone knows what's going on, but for those of us who do know what's going on, they didn't get burnt at the stake or put in jail, so they're just going to keep doing it. Long-term implications. Deficits become structural even without war or pandemic. The U.S. now runs on $1.5 to $2 trillion annual at deficits. Interest payments ballooned in 2006. Interest cost $240 billion, and in 2024 it's near $1 trillion, 4 times that. Inflation only went up 2 times. Fiscal policies change. If you could spend $5 trillion in a crisis without inflation immediately, why stop? Yep. Every future emergency will expect similar bailouts, and that's the fucking problem. It's kind of like feeding the animals in nature, or like out in the wild. Once you start feeding them, they kind of just expect it, and they become dependent, and because they become dependent, they can't survive on their own. It's really quite destructive behavior. Credibility and erosion. Allies and creditors, Japan, China, and EU funds now see the U.S. debt as politically untouchable. Repayment depends on perpetual refinancing. Basically just cooking the books. The war debt in 2000 to 2001 was $4 trillion in 10 years. COVID was $8 trillion in 3 years, which is fucking crazy. The pandemic period effectively doubled the U.S. peacetime deficit capacity, a historic turning point where emergency spending became the new normal. This is another layer where things are getting worse and worse in the country. We're going to feel the effects of it. Maybe not in the first year or two, but things are getting worse and worse. And by 2030, they'll probably be pretty ugly, or like considerably worse than they are now. And people are going to wonder, well, what the hell happened? Well, no shit. We just fucking inflated the fuck out of our currency. It's bound to happen. Things are not going to get better. We're reaping what we've sown as a society. Things will continue to get worse and worse until you make better decisions. And politicians are not going to take the brunt of this. People and taxpayers will take the brunt of this. So as long as they keep tolerating this, it's going to keep happening. So at one point, it did ask me, comparing 2025 versus 2035 interest and debt versus GDP, it makes things shockingly clear and use the word shockingly. And I figured out what the hell, I'll let it play around. So in the year 2000, you could see that, okay, this is pretty hard to see. Hopefully you guys can see it. But the U.S. fiscal time bomb, GDP versus debt versus interest in 2035. So for all intents and purposes, the interest payments hardly look like they're kicking up. It's almost kind of an irrelevant number. But the U.S. GDP is only so much, and the federal debt is well below it in 2000. And really right around here, about 2011, 2012, something like that, we see this inverse where finally the federal debt is actually bigger than U.S. GDP. You see that it gets inverted really around 2020 and 2025. It's kind of projecting it's going to get worse and worse. And this disparity is like what? Almost 12 trillion or something like that, whereas in 2025 it's only 5 trillion or so. So, it's just going to keep going and going. So the U.S. is entering a phase where interest payments on the national debt are exploding faster than GDP growth.
and faster even than defense or Medicare spending. In 2024, annual interest payments crossed 1.2 trillion, and that's more than the entire defense budget, which is nasty, because now we're not even doing anything, we're just paying off interest. Because guess who had a spending problem? It's also roughly 1/3 of all income tax revenue. So we're not even getting anything out of it, we're just paying off interest. That's pretty much a great way to piss away your money. If you told me that you were making $75,000 a year, and this is pre-tax, and you have a mortgage, and you're paying only interest as 33% of it, you're gonna feel like a fucking dickhead, right? This means that the government is spending huge amounts of money just to stand still, not build new infrastructure, fund schools, or support the economy, just to service past borrowing. And that's a nice way to put it. Affordability for the average American. The rising debt service cost doesn't stay in Washington. It ripples down to the economy in several ways. Higher interest rates persist longer because the Fed can't easily cut them without reigniting inflation while the government is still borrowing heavily, and it'll continue to do so. Mortgages, car loans, and credit cards all stay expensive. The government has less room to help during the future, job losses, recessions, because it's already maxed out. And something tells me it's not going to be maxed out. They're going to find ways to, fuck with more borrowing, so to say. Eventually, public services could face cuts, not necessarily right away. But over the next decade, programs like Social Security, Medicare could face real funding constraints. So Social Security and Medicare, get out of Social Security right now. I mean, it would be nice if we didn't have to pay it off. Just assume you're going to get $0 worth of stuff, right? Argentina is actually a really fun country to be in because you kind of hear people talk about this. I was talking to a taxi cab driver that was about 67 years old is what he told me. And I don't speak amazing Spanish, but I could kind of force feed my way through it. And I asked him, how did you feel about paying in, 20 years ago, their peso was like completely different. It was only like, 6-1 or something like that, and now it's like 14.50 to 1, so their inflation's like not even on the same level. It's like astronomical hyperinflation. But here's the thing, if you're paying into a Social Security kind of service here, if you paid 40 pesos back in the day, let's just say, I'm making up a number here, and those 40 pesos are going to be worth like 75 pesos, or it doubles, or it becomes like 85 pesos when you go to collect it. Well, if things cost 1,000 pesos here or 2,000 pesos here, what the fuck do you care about some double-digit number? Especially when you had to give away your good 40 pesos when it was actually worth something to get something that's not even usable today. And so I also learned that this guy likes Malay, and he said that Malay gets treated a lot like Messi did originally. Messi was hated here for a long time before he became big and famous, and then all of a sudden, overnight, everyone liked him. And I mean, he got a lot of flack in the 2000s, which I didn't know, and early in his career. But then he became this like national icon, and people flipped on it like that, right? And so this guy said that he felt like Malay was like someone who was like, oh man, this guy sucks, right? But as time has gone on, I guess Malay is someone who people trust more and more. It's still very polarized here. It's like 55-45, but at least that was that guy's opinion. And hence, when you're in another country, go ask about shit like that, if you can at least. Highly recommended. So while you might not feel the national debt or daily commute, it manifests as a heavier cost of living, less responsive government, and slower wage growth. Will this mean higher taxes for you? Almost certainly at some point, yes, unless spending is slashed, which is politically difficult. Short term, politicians resist raising taxes because it's unpopular, so they borrow more. And this is something the Democrats were trying to do to us, is like raise taxes. Thankfully, Republicans aren't trying to. They're just finding ways to spend shitloads of money. Medium term, 5 to 15 years, as interest crowds out other spending, the government will likely need to raise corporate taxes, capital gains taxes, and high-income marginal rates. There may also be stealth taxes. Inflation, yes. Reduced deduction, probably, and bracket creep, where inflation pushes you into higher brackets. That would be pretty fucked up. The brackets right now aren't like abysmally terrible, but there's always room for them to get worse. In other words, even if taxes don't formally rise the government, it could still extract more purchasing power from you indirectly, which is one of the most bullshit fucking things about the banking system. And too many people are just unaware of how something like that works. They're too, very much out of sight, out of mind. If it's not in front of me, I'm not going to look at it, nor think about it. The dollar's future strength depends on trust, and right now it's at the world's reserve currency because of America's size, liquidity, and stability. But if debt keeps ballooning and the Fed is forced to monetize it, print more money to cover it, that risks the gradual erosion of confidence. Absolutely. That doesn't mean hyperinflation, but it does mean the dollar may lose some purchasing power relative to real assets, gold, commodities, and real estate. We've already seen this. Over the long term, foreign investors could demand higher yields to hold U.S. debt, which reinforces the cycle. So while the dollar likely remains dominant for decades, it could buy less at home. A hidden tax on savers and wage earners. I mean, this isn't theory, this is just what's happening. In short, national debt rising fast, crowds outspending, interest payment exploding, limits flexibility. That's a nice way to put it. Inflation rates stay higher, borrowing costlier, taxes eventually higher, lower take-home income, dollar gradual erosion, weaker purchasing power. I mean, these are the two right here. Lower take-home income with weaker purchasing power. You're just going to have to make do with less, assuming you earn the same amount of money. Wages are not going up.
One last thing I'm going to mention here is that YouTube and the big tech platforms have been absolutely horrible, especially since COVID. We saw them banning people. We saw them taking videos down. We saw them using their AI systems to really just go crazy on people. And it's kind of like a third world government, the way they run things. You can't just like call a number. You can't really appeal. If you appeal, it's totally on their terms. You just send like a ticket in, and you have no idea what happens to it. It goes into the Wizard of Oz. There's like a curtain, and you magically will either get a no or a yes or something, but it takes a long time to respond, and it's impossible to get anything done because they keep moving the goalpost and changing the terms. That's why the terms are as vague as they are, because they can put a giant blanket over things and say, well, this falls under this, and they don't want anything to be clear and easy for the users and the video creators to make stuff. For those of us who are paying attention, we know exactly what was going on. I'm not going to talk about it at length in this video because this video is already pretty long, and I've talked about it multiple times on this channel, and I can't make this let's just complain about YouTube every single video. But during COVID, we learned a lot about people and censorship and society, and we also know that the big tech platforms today are based on all that BS model with the government and enforcing these rules, YouTube blames the government blames YouTube, but really they're both shaking hands behind everyone's back. And again, if Elon hadn't bought Twitter, then the Twitter files wouldn't have come out. The Twitter files were huge because they basically confirmed what everyone was already thinking, but had no proof of, or at least living proof.
So this was kind of random. This was not supposed to be a comprehensive like guide about like what exactly happened. There was just some kind of national guidelines, and I'm hoping that this does better than like the books will talk about it like 30 or 40 years from now about the pandemic era, you know, and about the way that people felt. Like these are the things where we see there's a lot of people at the time who are like, this is fucking suicide, and people do it anyway. So I'll talk about my personal experiences probably at some other time. But I just figured right now, because it's raining in Buenos Aires, this would be a good time to at least like touch on like a very heavy topic. I find it mind-blowing that people have forgotten about it, nobody mentions it, the cognitive dissonance that we experience, especially in California. And one of the craziest things is like the NPCs and the kind of doofuses of society really made themselves known, and it wasn't like they were hiding anymore. They were a lot more aggressive. It was like a moral outrage almost, and nobody was really holding back. A lot of the time people kind of hold back their ideas, and when you agree to disagree, you just kind of move on. But especially after COVID, that's not so much the norm anymore. And at that time, it became very obvious how many NPCs and kind of just like inside monsters we have, and people who are battling their own shit and have like given up, so to speak. So again, this is just kind of like the general trends and some of the takeaways compared to like Iraq and Afghanistan, which is kind of random. This is not, again, this wasn't supposed to be a full comprehensive thing. I just kind of thought of it in the moment, and it ended up being a lot longer than I thought it would. And ChatGPT is kind of fun to bounce ideas off of it sometimes, you know? Again, I don't know if it took all the data and how much of it was actually accurate. As you can see, it loves to omit some stuff. But yeah, thanks for stopping by, and let me know what you think the most egregious part of all this was in the comments.